I am so pleased and honored right now to welcome to the stage our hometown Bismarckian, if I can use the word Bismarckian, global activist, founder of numerous humanitarian projects, and all-around incredible woman, Shannon Galpin. And we are especially pleased that she's here because she flew in late last night from Paris, where she was speaking at an international conference. And with the time change and the jet lag, she's guaranteed us that she will be awake until at least 2 p.m. today. So thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. Shannon has an amazing story to share with you today, and she has an amazing vision for the future. She's one of those people who doesn't simply ask, what can we do? She then goes out and gets it done, and she really exemplifies the power of one to make a difference. Using the bicycle as a vehicle for social change, Shannon has been back and forth to Afghanistan many times to elevate the voice of women and girls in conflict zones. She has quite an impressive list of accomplishments, and I'm just going to go through a few, and hopefully she'll tell us about the rest. Shannon was named a 2013 National Geographic Adventurer of the Year. She is, wow is right. She is the founder and president of Mountain to Mountain, an organization dedicated to fighting for women's rights in conflict zones. Shannon founded Mountain to Mountain in November of 2006. After her own experiences as a rape survivor and a mother, she realized she couldn't just stand on the sidelines watching women and girls routinely raped, oppressed, and denied basic human rights. Believing that connecting communities on both sides of the equation is a key to combating apathy and changing perceptions, she became involved in human rights, and she's developed extraordinary events that involve communities and provoke discussions around the world through art, music, and sports. Supporting graffiti art projects in Kabul and creating art exhibitions, Shannon focuses on projects that empower voice and inspire others to combat apathy. In 2009, she became the first person to mountain bike in Afghanistan, a simple act that challenged gender barriers for women. She now supports and trains the first Afghan women's national cycling team. She has created a program called Strength in Numbers, a cycling program started in Afghanistan that is spreading globally to empower women to pedal a revolution. Shannon writes regularly for the Huffington Post and the Matador Network. She has been featured on Dateline NBC, The Today Show, Huffington Post, and in TED Talks. She is the subject of the award-winning documentary film Move Shake and the producer of a documentary about the Afghan national women's cycling team. Shannon is the author of the recently published Mountain to Mountain, A Journey of Adventure and Activism for Women of Afghanistan. And if you have a copy with you today, she is going to sign those books at the close of today's session. Shannon, we are so proud of your courage, your heart, your human rights activism, helping us and influencing us in Bismarck and around the world. Please help me give a warm welcome to North Dakota's own Shannon Galpin.
Thank you for having me, and probably the best introduction that I've had. I promise that I will stay awake for the book signing. It's going to be borderline, so I can't make any guarantees. So the short version of all of that is I am a mother, and I am an activist. I'm an author, a producer, a writer, an adventurer. I'm a North Dakota native and a Colorado transplant. And I am a feminist, and I am a survivor of gender violence. And my most important trait of all of that is I am a voice. I have one of over the 7 billion voices on this planet. And my work and my passion is in the space of women's rights and gender violence. And for the past 7 years, I have been working in Afghanistan, a country where if you are a woman, your voice is virtually non-existent, where even in a court of law, a woman's voice is worth 2/3 of a man's. But the more that I work in Afghanistan, the more that I have come to see the universal truths that resonate here, back home, even in North Dakota, as we heard earlier this morning. Many assume that I am passionate about women's rights because I am, in fact, a woman. And yes, as a woman, I am gratefully proud that I have the right to vote, that I can fight for equal pay, for equal work, that I, as a woman, want to make the same and only decisions, really, about my body and my future. And yet, I firmly believe that women's rights is not a women's issue. And while I work in a country where women have no voice, unfortunately, I see that voices are not being heard back here in the West. And I don't think that it's radical to say that I want the same rights that men have and that my gender should have nothing to do with it. I strongly believe that there is a war on women, and I think that we have proof of that here in our backyard from this morning when we were talking about sex trafficking and human trafficking. The interesting thing, and I'm going to have to revert back to my notes since I am jet-lagged, and this just came out this week, and it's really resonated pretty strongly with me because for so long we've talked about women's rights in this section of it being essentially a social issue. It's a women's issue. And yet, what we saw in Sweden recently was really impressive. The prime minister there has essentially gotten a lot of flack for creating a feminist, her words, a feminist foreign policy. And many scoffed at what is a feminist foreign policy? What does that really mean? And they put it into action a few weeks ago in negotiations with Saudi Arabia, which has one of the most appalling human rights records in the world against women. And yet, they are a country that we continue to do business with because they're also the largest oil producer, because they have a key place in the Middle East and are a key player. And Sweden refused to sign a bilateral arms agreement with Saudi Arabia on the grounds of their women's rights record, essentially saying, we refuse to sell you weapons when you cannot have gender equity within your own country. Something I've never seen any other Western country do. And while we can put that off as perhaps it's Sweden, that they're smaller, that this is not going to set a ripple and a trend, what's been really interesting is there's a lot of research and a lot of data that indicate that the more violent a state and its citizens are towards women, the less stable and peaceful that it is, and that in fact the best predictor of a state's peacefulness is not its wealth, it is not its level of democracy or its ethno-religious identity. The best predictor of a state's peacefulness is how well its women are treated. Politicians rarely look at women's rights as having a direct impact on the problems of war and peace, but according to the school of thought, and there's a lot of research, a great book, Sex and World Peace, which looks at a lot of the actual research that's been being done on gender equity in terms of stability. According to the school of thought, a foreign policy that strives to address global gender inequity should in fact be on the agenda of any politician concerned with global security. Few countries are likely to follow Sweden's example of angering the world's largest exporter and one of the most important players in the Middle East, but there is an obvious double standard when we look at how Western leaders stress the importance of both human rights and women's rights, but fall mostly silent on these issues as soon as immediate economic interests and political alliances are at stake. But one of our own back home, former President Jimmy Carter, stated in a book he wrote last year, and has been very public about this, that the abuse and subjugation of women is the most worst and pervasive, unaddressed human rights violation on earth. And those are strong words, and yet 2014 is the first time I hear any Western leader put that front and center. I mean, the fact is there's plenty of numbers to back up this statement. 1 in 3 women around the world will be sexually assaulted. 1 in 3. So when we look around this room and we look at how many women there are, that affects a lot of women in this room, whether it already has or whether it already will. And what I started to find was interesting is one of the bigger movements in America has been, in terms of advocacy and awareness and campaign building, has been breast cancer. Everything has a pink ribbon. And it affects 1 in 5 women. Yet something that affects drastically more women, 1 in 3, we don't hear a blip about. It's a side issue, it's a non-issue. And yet this affects everyone. And gender violence is not a women's issue. It affects the families. It affects men. All of you have mothers. Some of you have daughters. Some of you have sisters, wives, girlfriends. This is an issue that affects everyone at our core. That US women are being assaulted here, if we start to narrow down the stats, at a rate of 1 woman every 2 minutes, that's an epidemic. That is not a statistic. And I think when we look on the global front, if we kind of look at just some real specific numbers, looks like I cut that slide off, 14 million child brides, these are global, 14 million child brides, 4 million women and girls that are sold into slavery, 125 million women have endured female genital mutilation. And that's not just in Somalia, that's in Great Britain, that's in the US. These are numbers that are global, and that does not exclude North Dakota, does not exclude the United States, it does not exclude the Northern Hemisphere. They truly are global. And when we talk about sex trafficking this morning flourishing in our backyards, I think it finally starts to hit at home that we're not disparaging our state or our country when we talk about these issues. We disparage our state when we pretend that they're not happening and we don't do anything about it. So I think that the biggest issue is when we look at these sorts of numbers, we are overwhelmed. I am overwhelmed. And what I've started to discover in my work is that the biggest obstacle to anything that I choose to do or choose to talk about is apathy. And I don't think that it's because we as individuals are apathetic about these issues. I think we care. I think we care a lot. But I think that we're overwhelmed when we talk about 1 in 3 women, when we talk about 125 girls enduring female genital mutilation, even when we talk about the smaller numbers of how many women have been trafficked in North Dakota. It's overwhelming to think that there is a potential for change. All we have to do is turn on the news every day and see the stories of genocide and war and poverty and homelessness and violence. And instead of that pulling us in, thinking, oh man, I've got to do something, it pushes us out. And it makes us less likely to take action, because how can I, as one woman, against the 7 billion people every day making their choices, create any sense of action? How will my voice ever be heard? And in theory, I started to realize that when we're looking at these numbers and we're feeling overwhelmed and we're feeling that our actions are inconsequential, and I can look at the fact that my story is intrinsically linked with those numbers because I am one of them, and so is my only sibling, how can I be overwhelmed when I'm represented there? And yet that scope does move you to inaction versus action. And essentially even activists can suffer from apathy. But so when I realized my own apathy and my own sense of being overwhelmed, and also recognizing my own outrage that nothing was being done, and I caught myself saying, well, why isn't somebody doing something about this? And I came to realize that, well, yeah, why isn't somebody doing something about this? I am someone. I need to take action. I need to use my voice. The issues of our time, particularly when it comes to women's rights and gender violence, are not going to be solved solely on the backs of our governments and our multinational corporations and organizations that fight for these issues, or they would have already been solved. These issues come down to each of us as individuals taking action. If apathy is the barrier to change, what I have discovered is that perhaps voice is part of the solution. And a great example of voice is Malala. who now is a household name, even though she is a young girl from the tribal areas of Pakistan, an area just like those girls I work with in Afghanistan, where literally women have no voice. And as young as 15, she was advocating for the right for her and other girls like her to go to school. Very, very benign when you think of that. It's not a radical statement to want an education. Yet in Taliban-controlled tribal areas, it's incredibly radical, and so radical that Malala was shot in the head. The irony is she survived, and not just survived. Many of us, if faced with that sort of violence, would grow silent, would take a step back, protect family, go inward. She, from her hospital bed, shouted louder. She advocated for change even while her head was wrapped in a bandage. And I think that that shows really that we have to have a whole reframing of what we think a victim is. Because yes, she was victimized. So was I. And we're not silent. If anything, that spurred us to become louder and realize that we are needing to be in charge of our own destiny. And we need to sound the charges louder if people are going to take action. We can't rely on someone else to do that for us. Now at 17, she is literally the youngest Nobel Peace Prize winner to ever have won that honor. At 17. And I almost laugh in some respects that I'm sure the Taliban had no idea what they were about to unleash on the world when they tried to shoot her in the head. Her voice has rung out louder than they could have ever imagined. They gave her the most incredible platform because she chose not to be a victim. But I think that we have to really look around us to the less famous Malalas that there are all around the world. And we have to realize that they too are using their voice, just like she did. We're just not listening. I found my voice in the Kandahar women's prison. I'd been working in Afghanistan for 2 years. I had visited several prisons in Afghanistan, really out of a curiosity to understand why were women in prison, what were the judicial systems in place, where was the breakdown happening, that in a country where women have very little voice, and you have these great numbers of women being jailed under nebulous morality crimes, were there any solutions? And what I found was, through interviews with the Minister of Justice, is that the Constitution does allow for a legal process. It's simply that there's not enough lawyers, there's not enough judges, there's not enough people who are actually educated upon the law that's now written out in the Constitution in post-Taliban time. And certainly, these women are not their best advocates. These are women that are charged under adultery crimes, prostitution crimes, but they are victims of rape, often by a male family member, and they're thrown in jail. And knowing that this sort of thing was happening on a pretty large scale, knowing that I myself, as a victim of gender violence, thanks to a geographic passport, that is not my fate. But is there another way to advocate for those women who are illiterate, who can't defend themselves in the court of law, that are so used to the parameters of culture that they really don't speak out when atrocities happen? And it's estimated that 50 to 80% of the women in these Afghan prisons are there under different morality crimes. What I was shocked by, and why this particular instance, after 2 years of being in Afghanistan, why this moved me to tears, and why this literally amplified my own voice, which I thought I was using at the time, was that over the course of about 4 or 5 hours, these women poured out their stories to me. The prison commander gets a lot of credit here because typically the prison commanders and the guards are around you pretty closely when you're talking with the women. So you get a limited view of what their story really is because they're aware that people are listening. And he stepped back and he let me have free rein with just me, myself, and my translator to ask questions. And I mean, if you've ever been in that situation of simply wanting to ask questions on a very sensitive subject, these are women who are jailed, who have no prior interaction with me. What right do I have to be there to ask these questions that are their deepest, darkest secrets and fears, and traditions are in place around family. But the women literally poured their hearts out. And as one story was finishing, the next one started over and over and over all night long. Stories of abuse, of rape, marital rape, external rape, of a complete lack of rights. Stories that have horrified me through all my other visits. But in this prison, the fact that they were so willing to tell me their story, and they were so apparently validated when they did. And I realized that it was because no one had ever bothered to ask them what their story was. No one ever bothered enough to care why they were there, or who their family was, or what their background was, or did they even have hopes and dreams beyond the prison walls. And it really drove home how important voice was, how important it is to listen. I could do absolutely nothing to help these women. I'm not a human rights lawyer. My job was to understand the issue from a different perspective. And I realized in that moment that if we listen, we don't just understand the issue, we don't just scratch our own curiosity to understand an issue, but we're also giving validation that your story is worth hearing, that your voice is worth using. And I think in my case, a lot of these women looked at the fact that I would then take their stories outside those walls, and I would share them, and that somehow their story and the story of all women in Afghanistan could be heard. And so it was in that prison that I realized that the power of voice was to heal and to humanize and empower, as well as it is to change perceptions, and as well as it is to bear witness, and as well as it is to use your voice with the idea that it's a catalyst for change. So I had been working in Afghanistan on a variety of projects. I built a school for the deaf, I did some literacy projects in the women's prison, some kindergartens at a heroin rehab center, internet computer labs, all valid choices of projects to spearhead and to support. But what I realized was I was using somebody else's model. I was not using my voice. And I decided to change that. And so no matter how well-intentioned that was, I realized that I needed to be speaking out about my own experiences, something I had not done publicly. And it really wasn't until I started working in Afghanistan that I publicly started acknowledging that I am a victim of gender violence, that I was raped, that my sister was, and that we can both own that as strong, independent women and own that mantle of victim, but we can also be catalysts for change. We can show a different side of what that means, because if it's 1 in 3 women around the world that are sexually assaulted, why are we not talking about that? Why are we pretending it doesn't happen? And why are we thinking that a victim is someone who's rocking back and forth in the corner that needs to be helped and coddled? Victims are potentially the best chance we have at solving these issues. I mean, we heard one of the stories about the human trafficking. She's so effective because she's been on the other side. And she knows, not only has the empathy, but also understands what's going on inside the women of these human trafficking victims, and has the capacity to create more change. So I myself am really passionate about street art and photography as a means of looking at perception changing. We talked about PR campaigns earlier, and the fact that kind of the second phase of admitting there's a problem is then amplifying that. It's changing the public perception so that we can rally the masses behind an issue. So I was working in Afghanistan, and it's half the world away, someplace very few people have gone to. And I thought, what if I could simply create an interactive experience that could humanize Afghanistan, that could give voice to Afghanistan, and then thereby rally support around the projects I wanted to do. So I created a street art exhibition that I launched at the Denver Art Museum that was a collaboration for my very first visit in Afghanistan in 2008 with Afghan photographers and Western photographers. And the idea was we would bring a collaboration of perspectives on Afghanistan and showcase the beauty and the heartbreak. But I don't want to put them on the walls and drink wine and talk about this beautiful, exhibition, and then we all go about our daily lives. I wanted people to be surrounded by these images. So I found a way to blow each image up 10 foot tall by 17 feet across. And we set it up in Denver with a fundraiser, thinking, okay, this is the project. And that night, we're all clinking champagne glasses and saying, hey, job well done with all the volunteers. Thanks for helping pull this together. What an amazing thing to see this thing up. And I realized this isn't for Americans. This really does belong to Afghanistan. And I launched a Kickstarter campaign to raise the money to take the entire exhibition over to Afghanistan. And I set it up in 8 different public locations. This is in the village of East Alif, which is just outside of Kabul, about an hour outside of Kabul. And set it up along the market street on the first day of Eid. And then we set it up in the Babur Gardens in Kabul. We set it up in a women's garden in Kabul. I set it up in the Panjshir Valley in the mountains overlooking Masood's tomb. We set it up in several areas for Afghans, just public spaces, and popped it up literally like a pop-up street art exhibition so that they could be surrounded by the images that came from their own country and connect with them. And to bring art to an area of the world that so desperately needs it. I believe that street art in itself, and I know some people have a different view of graffiti versus street art versus tagging. We're not talking about tagging and vandalism, we're talking about art in public spaces. And one of the most prevalent voices, I think powerful voices, is Banksy. Banksy is a street artist out of London, hidden identity, whose work has been just launched probably 1 million copycats, because his work truly exhibits, you have scale with the man in the front, how big these things are, on walls in public spaces. These truly show the spirit of activism, but also the power of hope. This is on the wall in the West Bank. By very simple stencil art, he illustrates and gives voice to those that no one's listening to, or just essentially sneak attacks you when you're walking down the street to think about something differently. And I think that that's the beauty of art, is that it gives you a backdoor attack for activism. It gives you a way to have a conversation or to simply just randomly grab people to think about things differently. And it also has the power for those PR campaigns. In Egypt, after Tahrir Square, there had been an enormous spread of sexual harassment in the streets during protests and after. And women started putting street art stencils up all around to highlight this issue, that women are being attacked in the streets. Why are you not doing something about this? And because of graffiti like this piece, there became solutions that followed. One of them was a really simple solution that was a series of cell phone apps. Everybody has technology and cell phones around the world, and Cairo definitely embraces technology. Twitter was a big part of Tahrir Square, and everyone has cell phones. And they came up with GPS tracking and crowdsourcing through cell phones, that if you saw someone being attacked, you crowdsourced it, sent people in, and protected women right there in real time in the streets. But it started with street art. So I supported a street art exhibition, training workshop that led to an exhibition in Kabul with a dear friend of mine. And one of the women who came out of this was Shamsia. And Shamsia is a young woman who lives in Kabul. She was a Kabul University art student. We had 2 girls and 10 boys that went through a graffiti art workshop in the outskirts of Kabul. And this is one of her unfinished murals. But she has a whole theme now. This was in 2010, I think, 2011. So she's been doing this now very prominently throughout Kabul for at least 3 years. All of her images have this bluebird blue, which is the same color of the burqas that women wear in Afghanistan. And they all have a thread, as though these women are underwater. Many had a fish interwoven through the image. This one is starting, you can kind of see some of the curves. When it's finished, this is on the inside of a coffee shop of the courtyard in Afghanistan. So she was able to do it in stages very safely because it was a protected environment on the inside of the wall versus the exterior wall. Now it has little bubbles all around the tops of the women in burqas. And inside each bubble are words written in Dari. And each bubble is meant to represent the words that Afghan women say, but that no one ever hears, because no one's ever listening. And her work has become incredibly influential to a new generation of artists. And the beauty is when you do these things, it's not about having ownership over it, especially as a Western woman. It's about going in and facilitating and allowing things to unfold. And with Shamsia, one of the beautiful things was another woman that she had worked with, Nabila, embraced this methodology of large-scale murals. And they together set up an arts collective called the Bering Arts Collective, where they could stretch outside the confines of Kabul University and look at modern art and public art approaches and street art approaches, chalk art on the sidewalks. And there's the whole generation now flooding up underneath them with an exposure to how art can give voice to a generation that really is the most educated generation Afghanistan has had in 5 decades. And they do hold the hope that the future of Afghanistan could be better, but they need to be heard and they need to feel they have a voice, or else they're going to leave Afghanistan and they're going to go try to find jobs elsewhere where they have a future. And then you have the same problem we've seen in other countries, conflict and post-conflict, of just a brain drain. You want those educated, inspired, impassioned youth to stay and rebuild the country. And Shamsia is one of those amazing, amazing women. So Kim mentioned that I was the first woman to mountain bike in Afghanistan. So we're going to talk a little about this duality from a personal level of an athlete and an artist. I went to Afghanistan knowing that it was a country where women are not allowed to ride bikes. It's one of the only countries in the world, besides Saudi Arabia, which we talked about earlier, that are not allowed to ride. Saudi Arabia actually was illegal. There was a law on the books that if a woman rode a bike, she'd get thrown in jail. In Afghanistan, it's just a cultural no-no. It's been a taboo, and it's really the most deep-seated taboo that remains in Afghanistan. I have met more female politicians, I have met more female police officers, and I had met more women who had actually run and campaigned for president in Afghanistan than I'd met women who'd ever learned how to ride a bike. That's stunning. And yet in Afghanistan, I mean, this is essentially how you see women riding bikes. Not necessarily all in a burqa, but side saddle. Whether you're on a horse, a motorcycle, or a bike, you are riding side saddle. But in Afghanistan, there's a very unique role when you're a foreign woman. Most female journalists talk about it a lot as you're an honorary man. You are not an Afghan woman, so the blonder you are, the more you stick out. It's that instant recognition of, oh, you're not local. Okay, we'll treat you as a man. And so that has created this very unique access where as a hybrid gender, not just a woman, I have full access as a woman to the men that are the gatekeepers. So the men that will dictate what I can or cannot do, or what they will allow their daughters, their wives, their sisters to do or not do, I get to have unfiltered conversations with. And at the same time, because I'm a woman, I get full access to the women. So their wives and sisters and mothers that are in a completely different area, particularly when we're in rural Afghanistan, I can go in as a woman and speak freely with them and then learn, of course, not surprisingly, that the two sides are talking very, very differently about these issues. So it's put me in a very unique role as a proxy, essentially, to be the women's voice because I have direct access to them as a woman, but because I'm an honorary man, I can be their advocate in a way. And so knowing that Afghanistan is one of these countries where women can't ride, I decided that I would start pushing on that gender barrier myself. And I brought a bike over in 2009 and started riding in parts of the country where I knew locals, where I knew it was safe, I knew it was free of landmines, that I knew that I would not be offending anyone because I'd already asked locals, how would you feel if I rode a bike here? And they're like, yeah, go for it, it'd be funny. Having been told that women can't ride bikes because they're not intelligent enough to ride bikes. Riding a bike takes great intelligence. That's a quote from Eastalif in that street art exhibition. Not thinking into effect that, no, it's because you've never allowed women to learn to ride bikes. And yet, what I found was that while I was working to push this gender barrier, simply, again, out of curiosity, not as a means to get girls on bikes and defy this long-seated tradition, because that's not sustainable. As much as I might like that as an individual, that's not sustainable. My job isn't going in there to then force ideas upon a community. But I thought, well, maybe we can just look at what happens if a woman rides a bike, foreigner. And what would the reaction be? And time again, the reaction was curiosity, a desire to ride with me. This is a soldier in Bamiyan. It has been the most incredible icebreaker. Men will talk with me in the street that would never come up to me spontaneously because that's just not done. You know, the boundaries of culture would mean that an Afghan man is not going to walk up to a foreign woman and just start talking. But on the bike, they were so curious and flabbergasted often that these spontaneous conversations about culture, about who was I, where did I come from, what's my history, where are they, what is their village, where is their family, are they refugees, have they always lived here? We get to share our culture and we get to have really authentic conversations, and I get to listen and they get to share, and I get to share as an American woman that is traveling in their country, in their villages, on their roads, with no security, with no guns, with no nothing around me, just one person to one person, breaking down barriers. And every single time it is finished with offers of tea or dinner to meet their family, to understand where they come from. Because we're really all the same. I mean, that came through earlier with Scott. We're all the same. We all want the same things. We want our families to be safe. We want peace. And the irony was that while I was doing something that local women were not allowed to do, I was able to open up the conversation about why. Was there a reason you're not allowing this? So the interesting thing was, the bicycle in our own US history has an incredible role in the women's rights movement. So this all comes back to how I started. Women's rights. So the suffragette Susan B. Anthony, who we all know and love, said the most profound thing in the late 1800s, that the bicycle has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. Anything else in the world. That's stunning to me. And I love what she says after, just as much as what she leads with, which is that it gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance. I stand and rejoice when I see a woman ride by on a wheel, the picture of free and untrammeled womanhood. And I think we all grew up riding bikes in America and in the West. Those are some of my best and most profound memories. Was my first bike. I remember riding around my neighborhood on Avenue A, and once I was allowed to go visit my friends, which both my parents and my second parents, as I call them, are here, to go see their kids that were my friends a couple blocks up. Like, I get to do that by myself. I'm completely free to do that on my own. And that really is why bikes are so controversial. They are literally vehicles for independent mobility. In a country where a woman has no voice, you certainly aren't going to give her a tool for freedom. So the most interesting thing, when I was really working through what is the reason behind this, why are they so controversial? Why would a bike, even if you do look upon it as independent mobility, why is that so controversial that women are going to get insulted, rocks thrown at them, perhaps assaulted, just because they're riding a bike? When you see women in India riding bikes, bikes are not gender specific throughout Southeast Asia, throughout Africa. Why is it Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and in a smaller part Pakistan? So I started looking back to this history and why the bike was such an independent tool in the women's suffragette movement. It became a literal and a figurative symbol of freedom. Women like these, dressed, completely covered, were considered immoral and promiscuous at the time, simply because they rode a bike. I think that is so telling because it shows that this is not a cultural issue. This is not a religious issue. This is what happens every time a woman starts to ride bikes in a culture that has never seen that before. All of a sudden, we are this symbol of immorality on two wheels. And what we saw was that, thank goodness, women continued to ride. And around the time of this was late 1800s, so around the time of the women's suffragette movement starting to emerge, more women were riding, the bloomers emerged. They went from the petticoats to a split skirt to the bloomers. And there was a female at the time, one of these contemporaries, who was not pro-woman, even though she is a woman, who said that the wearers of the bloomers were women who had independent minds and tongues that knew how to talk, as though that was a bad thing. And I showed this slide to a group of young kids, high school and early college, that were at the National Youth Bike Summit. And their whole thing was bike advocacy. How do bikes build community? How do bikes, sports teams, all facets of what bikes do, advocating for bike lanes so that there were safer commutes to school. And it was an auditorium of 500 youth. I show them this picture, and I'm like, okay, it's incredibly conservative. There's nothing scandalous about how these women are dressed. This is nothing scandalous about how they're dressed. But in that time, this was like the Miley Cyrus hot pants. These women were radical on two wheels. And it wasn't long before those independent minds and talking tongues were changing all facets of women's rights, fashion, and sports. The bike did that in our own women's rights history. And I'm fascinated to see how it's done that in France and in England and in other countries as well. It's just that Afghanistan is a little behind the curve. So I have found that when you start to use your voice, when you start to talk about things authentically, when you start to own your own story, that's when change starts. And in Afghanistan, I had no agenda. I was doing my work, thinking that I'm going to, do these other projects. And on the side, every once in a while, over the course of what's almost 20 trips now, I'll go for a bike ride. And we'll just have conversations and see what happens. And then 2 years ago, I met these girls. This is Nazifa in the front, and this is the Afghan national women's cycling team. These are the first women of their generation to ever dare to ride a bike. And they do so with death threats and rocks thrown at them. I go on training rides with them now, and you're dodging rocks and insults. But they ride because they feel that this is their right. Their brothers bike to school. Why do they have to walk? And it's because there's an educated youth movement that has come through since the post-Taliban era, where women see, in a large part, thanks to technology, that around the world, women have equal rights. And that this is one small way that they can take back their streets and their rights and have independent mobility the same as their brothers. Most of the girls on the cycling team have the support of their family. The men, either their fathers, the coach, who is a man, started this team. He started it because he had 2 daughters. And I think that when you are a parent, there becomes those things that shift of, oh, this isn't so radical because I want to teach my girls to ride a bike. I would teach my sons to ride a bike. And it was that simple. He taught his girls to ride, started a team, and that has slowly flourished over the last couple of years. What has been beautiful to be part of, and I'm honored to be part of, is that, I started supporting them. We brought in bikes. I took over, I think, 800 now pounds of cycling gear, helmets. I bring it over as my extra luggage on United, which always throws them for a loop at check-in, that I would like to check these 80 boxes to cobble with me. But we've been supporting them with equipment and racing. If they get invited to go race in Pakistan, that we can send them there, or to India. They've raced in the Asia Cycling Championships. They have not yet finished those longer races, but they line up with the other women that are their regional counterparts. Because while I can go there and ride, I'm still white. I'm still a foreigner, I'm still Western, I'm American, and all those other things that go associated with that because I am different. But when they ride, they are mirroring back to their other counterparts that this is okay. I'm an Afghan girl. This is not obscene. This is not controversial. This is our right. So over the past 2 years, I've been supporting the team. When I'm there, I train with them. We go for rides. My former life, ironically, I never thought these would intersect, was a sports trainer. So I had to dig up some old knowledge that was still stuck in there. And also learn how to shift, because I'm a single-speed mountain biker. So I don't ride with gears. So learning to be a roadie on the roads of Afghanistan with these incredible women has been, one of my biggest joys that's come out of the trips there. We've now got them to a point where they are looking like a team. They are learning techniques, if any of you ride, drafting and what a peloton is and how to have better handling skills and all these things. And they recognize that every time they get on their bikes, one, they're taking an enormous risk. And they're fully cognizant, the same that Malala was. I'm doing this with great controversy, knowing that if I ride my bike, I'm going to have rocks thrown at me, insults thrown at me, I'm going to potentially dishonor my family, but it is my right. And at the same time, they realize that they're doing this because they don't just go and ride for themselves. They're going to ride to inspire the women that see them on the streets. One of the reasons cycling is so controversial in Afghanistan is that it is so inherently public. You can't ride a bike in a gymnasium. You can't ride a bike on a cricket pitch. All different sports that women take part in, boxing, football, soccer, cricket, volleyball, basketball. Those are sports that are being played by Afghan women, particularly in urban areas or at girls' schools, but they're closed off. They're not being seen by the public. These girls are on the roads. We're training on Afghan highways, trucking highways, because they're paved. We took them to Bamyan, which is in the central mountains, because there had been a big infrastructure project, so all the roads were newly paved and smooth, and there's hardly any traffic. It's relatively safe there. So we've done training camps up there. And time again, we look at how the bike has the potential to change, not just because of what I mentioned in terms of freedom and independent mobility for itself and for that feeling of self-reliance that it builds, but across Southeast Asia and across Africa, you see bike projects literally changing lives as community development tools. You can increase access to education. You can build fewer schools if you can get more kids to them in rural areas. You can have greater access to medical care if you can get midwives on bikes, and so their range expands. And it's an incredible tool to fight gender violence. In Cambodia, there's been a lot of studies where in the rural communities where girls were walking to school, particularly middle school girls, they're walking to school, and at great numbers, like nearly epidemic numbers, these girls were getting sexually assaulted walking to or from school. Bikes came into the picture. Different groups were donating bikes and trying to give them more access, not thinking about the gender violence issue, simply thinking about the access issue, that we could give them a 20-minute or 15-minute commute instead of an hour. And as a side effect, what they found was that the numbers of gender violence drastically reduced, because it's much harder to grab a girl on a bike than it is walking. A girl can get away. And also it's lack of opportunity. And so we see time and time again that the bike actually is an incredible social justice tool. It's in every country produced, it's cheap, effective, green, easily accessible. It's not a radical solution, and yet in Afghanistan it is. And these girls that ride are revolutionary. I mean, they are literally revolutionary two-wheeled activists risking life and limb for the right to ride a bike, because that's using your voice. It's a small action that is creating a great ripple in their community. When they have been asked, and I've asked many, because we are making a film about these girls, and which means that their faces go very public. We've asked them time and time again, are you sure you're okay with this? Is your family okay with this? Every single time we meet with them. And they all say yes, just like Malala would, just like when I meet with female members of parliament who get daily death threats just for trying to represent their province. Change does not happen by staying at home. Change comes with great risk, but the risks are worth it. And these women are on the front line, as are all the women that I've had the privilege to meet and to work with that are fighting step by step in small and in big ways for change. This is based on the idea that I mentioned earlier, that the biggest obstacle to change is apathy. We need to stop pretending that these issues don't happen, they don't affect us. We need to not think that if we don't talk about it or acknowledge it, that that it doesn't exist. As I stated earlier, it doesn't disparage our communities, our families, our state, or our country when we talk about these issues happening. It disparages us when we pretend they're not and we don't take action and we allow it knowingly to continue to happen. So, we have to blast through our apathy, I think, and to believe that change is even possible and that individual action makes a difference amongst the 7 billion people making their choices every day. But having a voice means taking a stand in protest, in petition, and in moral courage. Change happens when those who are unaffected are as outraged as those of us who are. When enough someones, we all are somebody, when enough someones are willing to use their voice, then change is possible. So as I leave us before the lunch break, and as we leave here later this afternoon after the panel discussion, I implore you to use your voice, to speak for others that don't have one or don't yet know they have one, to speak up for those that need your support. Don't leave here inspired and tomorrow forget that your voice matters, that you, all of us, are someone. Together, I don't know, we've kind of been filling up the seats today. I reckon we're 200 strong in here? Is that probably fair? 200 strong, just in this room. That's a roar that the world can hear. Certainly that the state can hear. Thank you.